Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Hello and a very good morning. You're very welcome to today's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. Today we're going to be talking about carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And we're going to be joined by a number of researchers from Moore Park who are going to give us an update on the toolkit that's been developed for agriculture in Ireland, particularly around methane emissions. And we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Hazel Costigan, who is a researcher in enteric methane emissions. Hazel, you're very welcome. And also Dr. Laurence Shalloo, who is head of the Animal Grassland Research and Innovation Programme in Teagasc. And we are also joined by Siobhan, Kavanagh, who is communication specialist with the Signpost team. So you're all very welcome to this morning's webinar. I know, Siobhan, you're going to be helping us out with questions. So a reminder to anybody who's new to the Signpost webinar, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and you're very welcome to submit any questions to this morning's panelists. So Hazel, I think this is your first time to join us on the webinar. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in Moore Park?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. So my name is Hazel Costigan and I am a researcher in enteric methane emissions down in Moore Park. So I focus mostly on the feed additives to reduce emissions, but we'd also look at genetics and grazing management as well.
Brilliant. And Laurence, you've been working in this area for some time. Obviously, the challenge is still there for reducing emissions from agriculture, but there's some really positive progress being made there by Irish farmers.
Yeah, Mark, I suppose if you look back, 5 years ago, we would have probably been quite despondent about enteric methane and what we could do about it. But, I think the program that has been in place for the last 4 or 5 years in conjunction with other work done in Ireland and internationally is telling us that there is progress that can be made. And I think that's what you're going to hear today, that there is progress that can be made. Some of that progress is near to delivery, and more of it's going to take a little bit more time to get delivery mechanisms. But for me, the big thing here is where we would have been a little bit despondent about enteric methane. I think we have a different view on that now on what we can do with it.
Right. And Siobhan, you're doing a lot of work on the ground with farmers and advisors across the country and getting that message out on the ground about what measures can be taken. What's engagement been like?
Yeah, I think engagement is good. I think farmers are willing to take the actions necessary to reduce emissions. And I suppose it's giving them that guidance to develop plans for their own individual farms. I think that's why the Signpost Advisory Programme, along with the Signpost Demo Farm Programme, has been hugely positive to give them a way of identifying what the number is for the farm and then creating a plan. And I think they are open to change. Like, we're judging the Teagasc FBD Environmental Sustainability Awards at the moment. We're out on farm. And the enthusiasm and the motivation of those farmers, I know they're a particular group, and they would say this, that farmers in their localities, they are willing to change. They just need that guidance from us. And I suppose technologies like this do give them hope that we can achieve our targets down the line.
Brilliant. And today is part of a series or a focus where we are looking at greenhouse gas emissions and what farmers are doing out on farm. And so today is just a natural progression on that, and we'll be hearing more about what advisors are doing in supporting farmers in that climate reduction journey, or the carbon reduction journey. So what I think we'll do is we'll head straight into the presentation and ask you, Hazel, you're going to share some slides with us, and we'll take some questions afterwards. And a reminder to everybody that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Teagasc YouTube channel, as well as the presentation on the Teagasc website. And don't forget that this session is also available as a podcast on all of the popular podcast platforms. So Hazel, we'll hand over to you, and we'll chat to you after the presentation.
So Ireland has been tasked with reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 51% by the year 2030. And within this, then, all the different sectors have been given their own individual targets. So the agricultural sector has to reduce its emissions by 25% by the year 2030, relative to 2018 levels. And Teagasc has developed this roadmap then to, I suppose, outline the different technologies that we can use to reduce our emissions and the stages at which they should be implemented. And as you can see, feed additives have a big role to play in meeting these targets, and they include the almost ready technologies such as the use of feed additives during the winter housing period, and early stage technologies, which are, I suppose, further down the line, and they are the use of feed additives at pasture. So there are three key pillars to Teagasc's climate action strategy. The first of which is our new climate centre. So this focuses on climate research and innovation, and it would, I suppose, further develop technologies like the early stage and almost ready technologies, the feed additives. The second of which is AgNav, which is our new online digital sustainability platform. So this platform, using this platform, farmers can get a baseline level of their farm-specific emissions using their milk, fertilizer and feed data. And they can put a plan in place then to reduce their emissions. And the last of which then is the Signpost Advisory Programme, which is a cohort of 120 farmers that are, I suppose, flagships for climate action initiatives. And these farmers are tracking their emissions with a commitment to change by putting an action plan in place. And they're supported by a dedicated team of signpost advisors. And it's hoped that we'll be able to increase the number of signpost farms to 50,000 by the year 2030. So in terms of our agricultural greenhouse gas emissions then, enteric methane accounts for 65% of our emissions. So reducing our enteric methane emissions will have a huge role to play in whether or not we can achieve the target set out to us. So that, I suppose, that forms the basis then of the research programme that we have in place in Moorepark, which is to, I suppose, improve the understanding of enteric methane emissions in our grazing dairy systems, and then ultimately to develop solutions to reduce it. So at present, when a country doesn't have enough, I suppose, of their own methane data, they have to use an internationally derived methane conversion factor. And this is calculated by multiplying the gross energy intake of the cow, which is the energy that she uses to produce milk, to support pregnancy and to gain body weight. And that gross energy intake is multiplied by this standard emission methane conversion factor of 6.3%. So this figure assumes that 6.3% of all the gross energy intake that an animal consumes is used to produce methane. So methane is actually an energy intensive process for the cow. So I suppose that's how we currently calculate our national methane emissions. And what we're doing then in Moorepark is comparing that to, I suppose, measured data. So we measure methane using green feed machines. So this is a trailer mounted green feed machine. So how it works is the cows voluntarily visit the machine a couple of times a day, and there's a feed bin which drops concentrate feed into the hood. So when the cow goes in, an RFID reader scans her ear tag, and if she's due a feed of concentrate, it will drop a small quantity of concentrate into the bin, and then a fan works to take a sample of her breath while she's in there. This breath sample is then analysed for methane concentration. So my colleague then, Dr. Ben Lahart, measured methane using the green feed machines across the grazing season back in 2021. So what he found was that there was a huge seasonal nature to methane output in grazing dairy cows, with the average methane conversion factor was 5.2% over the course of this study. And what we're using at the minute in the national inventory is a figure of 6.3% that I spoke about previously. So there's a bit of a difference between what we're currently using and what's being measured our cows are measured to produce on farm. And this study was published in the Journal of Dairy Science earlier in this year. So this just shows, I suppose, the difference between the calculated and the measured methane throughout the grazing season. So in the spring, there was a 40% difference between calculated and measured methane. In the summer, this was 20%, and in the autumn, the methane was similar between the prediction equations, and that was measured using the green feed machines. So I suppose it's important to note that the study I just spoke about is just one study, but when we looked at all the different studies that have been taking place under grazing conditions in Ireland to date, the average methane conversion factor was about 5.8%. So there's still a significant difference between, I suppose, 5.8 and 6.3%. So our methane is, I suppose, currently being overestimated because our models don't take into account the genetic improvement of our herd and the quality of the pasture that our animals are consuming. So in terms of mitigating methane then, there are three key areas, the first of which is breeding, grazing management, and then feed additives. So I'll just touch on grazing management first. So based on the study that Ben carried out, methane is, I suppose, considerably lower during the spring. And this is because the spring grass contains less fiber and it's more digestible. So one way to use grazing management to reduce your methane would be to utilize the high quality spring grass. So getting cows out to grass early where possible. Then in the mid-season and in the autumn, we can reduce methane by ensuring that the animals are grazing high quality pasture. So putting them into covers of 14 to 1600 kilos of dry matter per hectare. And I suppose one of the focuses for us going forward will be to collect more on-farm pasture quality data so that I suppose we'll eventually be able to incorporate grass quality into our national methane prediction equations. In terms of breeding then, another study that was done by Dr. Ben Lahart was to compare two different cohorts of cows. So a high EBI cohort, which is the elite cows, which had an average EBI of €233, with a group of national average cows which had an average EBI of about €133. And the high EBI cows produced about 8% more milk solids than the national average cows, but they didn't produce any more methane, or not significantly more methane. However, when we, I suppose, predicted these cows' methane using the models that we use in our national inventory, the high EBI cows were predicted to have significantly higher methane. And this is because methane, as I touched on in the first slide about the gross energy intake multiplied by the methane conversion factor, our models assume that if cows are producing more milk solids, that they're also producing more methane. But this study showed that it's not necessarily the case. I suppose within then all the studies that we've done to date, we've noticed that there are cows that are consuming the same amount of feed, they're producing the same amount of milk solids, they weigh the same, but some of the cows would produce considerably more methane than the others. So I suppose one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, how much of this variation is due to genetics? And can we measure it on farm? Because eventually the hope is that we'll be able to directly select for low methane emitting cows. But the challenge with this is having enough data to include it in the likes of the EBI. So now I'll move on to the feed additives. So I suppose, what do we want from a feed additive? A feed additive must be capable of reducing methane. It must be easily delivered to the animal. There can be no effect on performance. Palatability issues should be kept to a minimum. There can be no food safety or milk residue issues, and we should be capable of accounting for it in the national inventory. So those are the must-haves. In terms of desirables then, it would be desirable if the additive was low cost, if it also increased performance in cows, if it was a natural origin, that would be great. And I suppose if there was the potential to combine it with other additives to get a greater reduction in methane. So there's a significant program of work ongoing in Teagasc. So we look at additives and we look at the effect that they have on enteric methane, on animal performance, on residues in the milk. And we're also, I suppose, have a greater focus on how we deliver these additives to grazing dairy cows. So we've tested lots of additives to date. Some of them have shown little impact and others then have shown significant promise. So I suppose what we're focusing on is trying to find an additive that's compatible with grazing systems. And there has been an awful lot of research done to date. I suppose the two standout additives have been Asparagopsis, which is a red seaweed, and 3-Nop, which was created by the Dutch company DSM. And this was a review paper that was done by a group in New Zealand. So it lists all the different additives that are available and it ranks them, I suppose, in terms of their methane reduction potential. So as you can see at the top, 3-Nop and Asparagopsis, the red seaweed, are coming out on top in terms of their methane reduction potential. And there's an awful lot of papers there to back that up. But it's important to note, I suppose, that all these, or most of the studies that have been undertaken to date, have been in TMR or indoor feeding systems where the cows are indoors all the time, and it's relatively easy to feed the additives in comparison to a grazing system. So 3-NOP is the first additive that I'm going to go through. So it's the long name, I suppose, is 3-nitrooxypropanol, and it was approved for use as a feed additive in the EU in 2022. And there's over 50 papers published to date reporting reductions in methane of about 30%. So how it works is it binds to an enzyme in the rumen called methyl coenzyme M, and it prevents then the methanogenic bacteria from binding to carbon dioxide and hydrogen, and ultimately stops the formation of methane. So we did a study in 2022, a 10-week study. So we fed 3-NOP on exit from the milking parlour morning and evening. So we weighed out, it was 13.6 grams a day, so 6.8 grams morning and evening milking. And that was mixed in with 500 grams of coarse ration, and it was fed to the cows in buckets coming out of the parlour. So as you can see, for about 2.5 to 3 hours after the cows consumed the additive, there was a 30% reduction in methane. And this is comparable to what they're seeing in the indoor feeding systems, where they're getting reductions of 30% across the day. But as you can see then, after the 2.5 to 3 hours have elapsed, the methane of the treatment cows reverts back to similar to that of the control. So over the course of the day then, there is about a 6% reduction in daily methane. And I suppose what this study highlighted for us was the practicalities of feeding additives on grazing dairy farms, and I suppose just showed us that for future research on feeding 3-NOP in grazing systems should focus on slow release mechanisms. And this study is currently in press in the Journal of Dairy Science. So for the majority of the year, our cows are out grazing, and they're housed during the winter, during the non-lactating period. So I suppose it's difficult to feed additives during the grazing period, and it's slightly easier to feed them during the winter housing period. But I suppose for a period in the autumn and the spring, as weather conditions worsen, cows are sometimes housed by night and offered a diet of silage, and they're out grazing by day, I suppose, to reduce the impact of poaching. So I suppose this is what we wanted to simulate in one of our most recent studies. So we had the cows grazing together by day, and then by night they were brought into the shed, and half the cows were offered a silage with 3-NOP mixed through it, and the other half of the cows were offered silage on its own. And in feeding the 3-NOP in this way, we saw a 13% reduction in methane with no effect on performance. And I suppose what this showed us was it's possible to extend the time frame in which we can use these additives on grazing dairy farms, I suppose, outside of the winter housing period. So my colleague Ben also did a study in which we fed 3-NOP during the winter housing period. So the additive was mixed throughout the perennial ryegrass silage diet using a diet feeder, and it was fed to the cows, and we saw a 22% reduction in enteric methane across the day. So I suppose this type of trial would correspond to some of the almost ready technologies that I spoke about in one of the first slides. And I suppose we recognise that not all farmers would have access to a diet feeder. So we did a follow-up study this winter gone by, or Ben did the follow-up study, and we mixed the 3-NOP with dry cow minerals, and we dusted it onto the silage twice daily. And in feeding the 3-NOP in this way, we saw a reduction of 11% across the day. So I suppose there's two options there for farmers that have access to diet feeders and farmers without. So it is possible to feed additives during the winter housing period on all types of farms. I suppose I'll just touch on another couple of studies that were done during the grazing period. So we fed a calcium peroxide based feed additive, which was created by Galway company Glassport Bio, and we saw a 13% reduction in enteric methane. However, we also saw that the animals had a reduced feed intake and milk solids output. So it's important to note, I suppose, that these performance measures are looked at throughout all of our trials. And what we started a couple of weeks ago was we started feeding Asparagopsis to the cows on exit from the parlour. So Asparagopsis is a red seaweed. It grows best in warm water, and they've started growing it in tanks around Europe. So it's a really good additive, and it's early days, but what we're seeing is really promising. So for all of our trials, we ensure that there's extensive milk sampling. So we look at milk quality. Milk quality samples are taken weekly. We are also looking at the effect of additives on milk residues. We take bulk tank samples on a couple of occasions throughout the trial, and we use that milk then to produce butter and milk powder to ensure that there's no effect of additive supplementation on heat stability of the milk and processability. And we're also going to, I suppose, test some of these products in front of a sensory panel to ensure that there's no effect of the additive on the likes of flavour. We also keep close eye on health and performance of the animals. So we look at dry matter intake, body weight and body condition score are measured weekly. All cows have access to collars to measure grazing behaviour and rumination. And we also take rumen samples and blood samples throughout the trials. So I suppose that's the research that's been done. Last winter, we also, I suppose, did a pilot study with some of the Signpost farms to, I suppose, start the rollout of these additives on farm. So we fed Treagasc to 3,500 cows across 18 of the Signpost farms. And I suppose the purpose of this was to show that we as an industry are harnessing all the available technologies to reduce our methane emissions. And these farmers used the diet feeder to mix Treagasc throughout the silage. So therefore, the additive was in their rumen and actively reducing methane throughout the day. We didn't measure any methane in the pilot study. We just assumed a 22% reduction in methane based on the findings of Dr. Ben Lahart in the Moore Park study. So I suppose if this was fed over an 8-week period, or the 8-week, I suppose, non-lactation period, this would equate to a 3.3% reduction in methane across the entire year. And we're incorporating the impact of feeding the Treagasc in the calculation of the greenhouse gas emissions for those Signpost farmers for 2023 and 2024. I suppose just to circle back then, I suppose as the saying goes, you can't manage what you don't measure. And I suppose AgNav will have a key role to play in helping us to, I suppose, track the farmers that are using additives. We'll incorporate the additives into AgNav, and we'll be able to measure then the mitigation potential of the farmers that are using the additives. And then I suppose just to conclude then, I suppose in terms of future research, we're going to continue evaluating promising feed additives. What we've seen to date, it's important that it's practical to feed these additives on farms, and delivery to grazing dairy cows is going to be a huge challenge. And I suppose that's where the likes of slow release mechanisms will come in, especially for the likes of Treagasc. We have a big focus on looking at residues in the milk to make sure there's no transfer of the additive to the milk. We're also going to look at life cycle assessment to ensure that, I suppose, it's the emissions taken to create the additive are not outweighing the mitigation potential of the additive. And we're also going to focus on the cost and, I suppose, the business model of feeding these additives on farms. So that's all. If anyone has any questions.
That's great. Hazel, thank you. Excellent presentation, and you gave a really good insight into some of the challenges there associated with these feed additives. I mean, you talked about a 3.3% reduction there from feeding animals for over an 8-week period for an annual for the year. Have you had full year trials with any of these products?
No, Mark. I suppose at the minute what we're doing is, I suppose, a proof of concept to see if they can work on farms, and I suppose the next step then would be to, I suppose, improve the delivery. Like it's not practical to feed the cows with buckets, so we suppose make them more suitable for grazing systems, and then I suppose we'll do long-term trials then.
Okay, very good. And maybe Laurence, if I could bring you in here. Look, we've recently seen the figures published there by the EPA in relation to our targets, national targets for achieving our 51% reduction by 2030. I suppose there's some degree of pessimism from the Climate Change Advisory Council around these figures. How quickly or how realistic do you think is it that we're going to hit that 25% target for agriculture?
Mark, I generally see myself as a kind of a positive person. I think that report talks about an 18 to 19% reduction in emissions, which is a really positive move from agriculture by 2030. So that's the starting point. So like getting that further piece from 18 to 19 to 25% will be a significant challenge. And it's the things like you heard from Hazel today will be important in contributing to that. Within the process, when we look at our marginal abatement cost curve from last year, the additional, there was to hit the targets, we needed additives, feed additives, to deliver a significant part of methane reduction. And it's what you're hearing today, what you're seeing today, that new stuff that is going to be key to delivering on that. If we are to hit those targets, some of these things that Hazel talked about will have to be in a significant proportion of our dairy and beef animals diet by 2030.
Hazel, you talked about some of the challenges about feeding at grass, and you mentioned about the slow release, a bolus, I presume, of sorts. Has there been any work looked at including this in the water or other delivery mechanisms?
I suppose that's a question that we get asked all the time, is about what about putting it in the water. So I suppose the quantity of water that a cow would consume varies, I suppose, definitely between cows, but also from a day to day, depending on the temperature, the grass, the dry matter of the grass. So it'd be very hard to regulate how much additive that they were consuming if that was put through the water. So it is. I don't think it's a runner. I suppose in addition to that, there's downstream effects of putting things into the water, like there'd be birds and wildlife and things like that drinking that water too. So and it would go into the groundwater. So we just have to, I suppose, those are the barriers to putting it through the water.
And Hazel, just to come in on that, like even if you think about the EFSA approval, I think for Bovaer, for example, I think is a maximum of 80 milligrams per kilo of dry matter intake, and the precision we need, to deliver that would have to happen through a feed application in the milking parlour or something. The water variability, as Hazel said, is huge, so that would be a problem,
Mm-hmm. And just on the persistence you talked about there, Hazel, it getting into the ecosystem, are there any concerns attached to that?
I don't think so, Laurence. Maybe you can come in on that. I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, obviously every product that we be looking at, we need to take that into account, and they'll have to go through EFSA approval, like we've seen with Bovaer for dairy cows. It's not there for beef animals yet, but it will be there pretty soon, we expect. It's just been approved for the US, so all those considerations would be taken into account for those type of products. The other important thing here is a lot of the stuff that we're looking at, whether it's essential oils, whether it's fats, whether it's the seaweeds, a lot of these are natural products that that are not chemical products, which would have, I suppose, less rigorous need for those types of questions to be asked.
Actually, there's a question that came in from one of our audience members around how suitable or acceptable would this be for organic farming, or has there been any consideration of that being made?
So I suppose it very much depends on the product, So the Bovaer product, we've actually looked into this as part of the work we were doing, the Siobhan and with Siobhan and Tom and the Signpost team, and no, Bovaer wasn't in that. It was not seen something that would sit in with the organics. But a lot of the other products, the Asparagopsis, the other products, they're all natural products. I would say would be much less of an issue in an organic system.
Hazel, you talked about the let's say the impact on the technical impacts of reducing greenhouse gas emissions or methane emissions. Have you looked, or has anyone been looking at the economics of this, and how well is this going to sit within an Irish context?
Laurence is probably better. Johnny,
Yeah.
look at the economics.
Yeah, so it's a very, very, very important question, and I'm sure that Siobhan and Tom are probably laughing there in the background, because it was very much something that came to our minds very quickly when we started thinking about the pilot project with the Signpost farms. 3,500 cows for 8 weeks. You'd say to yourself, okay, that's not very significant, but it gets to very significant money very, very quickly. So it's a very important question, Mark. if there's no performance benefit, if there's no health benefit, if there's no other benefits that we're seeing at an animal level, then the question for any farmer, dairy farmer, beef farmer, sheep farmer is, what do I get out of it? And that's where we need to start having serious conversations around whether it's cap, whether it's market support, whether it's direct consumer support. That's where the rubber will hit the road. But I suppose for us, the focus has been getting those technical solutions evaluated and validated from an Irish context. And then at that point, we can also be having a really serious question is, can these commercially be used, or is there a financial incentive to use these?
And I expect that, if this is accepted technology, that the costs will come down over time. I'm sure once if production systems get into place. Siobhan, we're having a lot of questions coming in here, a lot of interest in today's topic.
Yes, plenty of them. A lot of questions around the cost of it. I suppose there have been one or two direct questions around how much did it cost, say, for an 8-week feeding period on that trial for individual farms. I don't know, Brendan or Hazel, do you want to take that direct cost of it? I know you've talked about the affordability and incentives of it, but at the moment, what is it costing? I suppose the question.
Was it Laurence 15?
Yeah, no problem. So roughly for that eight-week period, it was somewhere between 13.50 to €15 to per cow, to do that study for that each cow per day, for that period, for that full period of time. So that was the cost. When we spoke to the farmers afterwards, they would have seen that there would have been very little, I suppose, additional work, I think was the comments that they made with it. So from that point of view, it can be either mixed in with your dry cow mineral directly, or it can be put in separately when you're mixing your TMRs. So there's no additional work, I suppose, or not huge additional work from that point of view. So the big thing is the direct cost per animal for that feeding.
Yeah.
I just add to that, Siobhan, that it's fed, as Laurence said, based on their kilograms of dry matter per kilo of dry matter intake. So in the dry cow period, they would have been consuming around 12 kilos of dry matter. In the grazing season, even though we haven't, I suppose, cracked how to get it into grazing cows yet, that their intakes will be higher. So I'll just add that in, that it's fed 80 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter intake.
Okay.
Probably another important one to come into, Sean, just, when Hazel talked about a 6% reduction per day during the grazing season, obviously, whatever cost you put on that, it's going to be extremely difficult to get that to make sense. So obviously, for that to make any sense at all, whoever is going to pay for it would need those reductions have to be increased.
Okay. There's a question here, and I suppose this is one that regularly comes up. How do we get these? What criteria need to be in place for the feed additives to be included in the national inventory? So I suppose, what's the process for getting them included in the national inventory, which ultimately is where we need to get to?
Yeah, and again, first of all, I suppose there has to be work done in the country to show that they're effective in the country, and that's work that's kind of important. Then I suppose it has to be accepted by the inventory team that it's something that works from an Irish context, and then we need the activity data to see how how much of this has been used, so as it can be included in the inventory. So the steps there, very much the currency here is scientific papers, and Hazel mentioned a few times, or she referred a few times to scientific papers, and that's our currency. We need to publish this stuff, and it's.
We seem to have lost Laurence there temporarily. Just a question for you, Hazel, in relation to the reduction in the efficacy of the 3-NOP over that longer period. Have you any concerns about that, or how can that be managed?
Yeah, so I suppose the answer is we're not sure yet, Mark. Most of the studies that we do are kind of short-term studies, and I suppose we will eventually have to do full activation studies just to ensure that there's no that the microbes don't adapt in the rumen over time. But we don't know yet, I suppose, is the answer.
Okay.
Mark, maybe as a follow-on question to that one about getting feed additives into the industry is to be included in the Board B quality assurance scheme. And I can't talk for Board B, but I would imagine it needs to be recognised in the inventory before it will be included there. But maybe Laurence might comment on that. So yes, it's included as far as the carbon footprint section of the quality assurance scheme, I'd imagine.
100%, Siobhan, and that's something that will be worked at. We're actually currently in the process of getting it into AgNav, so that as part of your mitigation strategies when you go into AgNav, that you can include the inclusion of an additive, and it'll have to be specific. You know, each additive will have a different effect, so we'll have to be specific on the additives that are included. Yeah, so we would see these running in tandem. That once they're in the inventory, they can go into AgNav and vice versa.
Yeah. Can the feed additives be included in dairy nuts?
Yeah.
Is there an impact on processing?
So I suppose this was a question that came up for us a good bit initially. When we did the first study with the Bovaer in the summer of 2022, I suppose we were afraid that by incorporating it into the pellet, that the heat and the pressure in the pelleting process would damage the efficacy of the additive. So we said at that time it would be safer just to feed it with a coarse ration. Now it's since come out that is not the case, and that they can pellet it relatively well. So I suppose just a point to add to the fact of incorporating it into the pellets, like that's probably the way we need it to actually get it to work on farms. Like it has to be simple for the farmer. It can't really produce any extra labor for the farmer. So putting into the pellet is probably the best way forward. But I suppose just pellets are formulated to contain, I suppose, enough minerals and vitamins and all that for like a 2 kilo feeding rate. So you'd also have to include enough additive, I suppose the daily additive allowance for the cow in that 2 kilo feeding rate. And farmers would feed the 2 kilos or the 1 kilo or whatever for the majority of the year. But if you run into a drought or anything like that, you'd have to increase the feeding rate up to 4 or 5 kilos. So at that point, then you're probably overfeeding the additive to the cows. So I suppose that's going to be a challenge going forward too. Like, would farmers need to have a second feed bin that they kind of use in case of emergencies? I'm not sure, but that's one of the discussions we've been having.
Okay. And the boluses then, are they an option? Because there's we know if they've worked for minerals, is there potential there with boluses to carry the additive?
So I suppose with the boluses, you have to think of the amount that the cows would be getting per day and how much of it would fit into a bolus. So like with the tree nut, I suppose it's probably one of the best candidates for a bolus, because I suppose the tree nut that we were feeding, that was it's called Bovaer, it's a 10% diluted version. So if you were to feed pure tree nut, you'd only need 1.36 grams per cow per day. So you'd have to fit enough for 6 months or whatever into a bolus, I suppose, to make it viable. With some of the other additives like the seaweeds, you need 20 grams per cow per day. With the calcium peroxide, you need a couple of 100 grams per day. So I suppose in terms of fitting the additive into a bolus, tree nut is probably the most promising.
There's a few other alternatives being mentioned in the questions, like tree leaves from willow have been tried. Daffodil extract there's a bit of work going on that in the UK. Can you just comment on maybe some of the other things that might be coming down the line that might have potential?
Do you want me to go to like Siobhan? There's lots of work done around the world on lots of different products. We've done, and Hazel didn't mention it, I think, but we've done lots of other things that we found little to no benefit, in different products. So important that that we take that in context. But I don't think we're in a position to say that anything won't work. So the approach we've been taking is we've been pretty much, someone came to us with a product, or we went looking for a product that had any sign of a positivity in the literature, we went after it. And it's only when you do your study and it's a controlled study that we can say, right, something is or isn't going to work. Like there's lots of work done on tannins, condensed tannins, and some of these products have a benefit. The issue then will be about scaling it. The issue will be about getting them into animals at scale, larger scale, that we'll have to be thinking about. But I don't think we're in a position to rule anything out, to be honest, Siobhan.
Yeah. This question here, I suppose this is coming back to the cost of it again, and I suppose it is a pertinent enough question. I know, Laurence, you're talking to a lot of people in this area about this. Are retailers and processors willing to contribute to the cost of using these additives?
And if you asked me that question a year and a half ago, I would have said, I'm not sure. And if you ask me now, I'd say I definitely think there is definitely movement in this space. There is definitely movement in these schemes, and we talk about scope 3 emissions and CR, science-based targets to reduce emissions, and that's changing the dial or moving the dial in terms of the requirement for some of these companies to reduce their footprints and their overall emissions. So that's changing the narrative and changing the willingness to be part of the solution and invest in part of the solution at farm level.
Okay.
I know there's been some.
Sorry, Mark,
Yeah,
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead, Siobhan. I was just remembering a question that came up before in relation to the, I think it was Asparagopsis, and the harvesting of seaweed and the ecological impacts of this that this could potentially have. But I understand they have, like you mentioned about it being grown in a sort of artificial environment, or maybe potentially synthetic versions of these. Just could you maybe talk to us a little bit about those, how those concerns are being allayed?
Yeah, so I don't know a huge amount about the environmental impact of actually harvesting it, but I do know, I suppose the asparagus that we're using for the trial at present was grown in tanks by a Swedish company. So I suppose by growing it in the tanks, they can, I suppose, produce a controlled, consistent product. So I suppose that's going to be the way forward. I'm not sure, maybe Laurence knows if there's an environmental impact of tanks, growing it in tanks as well.
No, and I think a lot of that ecological issues that was talked about in the past was the wild harvest and the sowing of it at sea. I think the initial work in this space is suggesting that if we want Asparagopsis to be scaled up, it will have to be in as Hazel said, with consistent concentrations of bromoform. It will have to be within potentially within in tank environments, and that's something that there is significant work going into at the moment across Europe and globally in Australia as well, looking at ways to get that material in a form that is consistent. And I suppose the biggest issue there has been with Asparagopsis over the last 3 or 4 years has been to getting enough of it. It's been quite limited in supply. And I suppose that's important, Hazel, that we mentioned Future Feed here, which are an Australian company who I suppose have done the vast majority of the running with Asparagopsis. We're working with these. We're linked with Future Feed. They've sourced the material for us for the study that we're currently doing, that Hazel is currently doing.
Which maybe there's a business opportunity for some Irish company there. The demand for this is likely to increase in the future. Just a question there in relation to the bromide and health effects of Asparagopsis. Any concerns there?
So I suppose again, it's a very valid question, and that's part of what we're looking at in terms of the residue part, of that material transferring into the product. So that's something that we will be very keenly looking at. Hazel mentioned that we're producing cheese and powders and butter from this product, and the intention then is to be able to look at go into much more detail then on these materials and on these products to see are we seeing any residue coming through.
Yeah, so generally, I suppose that we'd be feeding it in very small quantities. So the hope is that there'd be no transfer to the milk. And I suppose even something that Future Feed flagged with us was that we're taking, as part of the trial, we're taking water samples from the water trucks in the field and the milking parlour, because in some previous studies they've seen small quantities of bromoform even appearing in the control milk, and I suppose they just wanted to show us that bromoform can actually be in water. It's all around us. It's just not necessarily there in big enough quantities to cause harm. So I suppose as Laurence said, we're looking at all of that as part of this trial, the residues in the milk, in the water, everywhere.
Okay, we've lots more questions. I do keep them coming. Is it possible to measure the reduction in feed/grazing intake per milk solids? Is a question here. Not sure what angle that's coming from?
Not sure either. Is what's so yes, we can measure intake. I suppose what we do is we measure intake using a technique that's called an N-alkane technique, which is basically putting in a tracer into the animals and measuring intake or estimating intake based on that tracer. And it allows us then to be able to estimate intake as well as methane emissions.
Okay.
Hazel, you mentioned early on that there's significant energy cost associated with producing methane in the rumen. Would you have expected, like if you were cutting back on the quantity of methane that's being produced, that there would be more energy available for milk production or output? Would you have expected a response in terms of animal performance from using the additive?
Yeah, so I suppose the hope would be that if the animal's producing less methane, that there'd be more hydrogen available for producing other things. But we haven't seen anything in any of our trials. I suppose with the grazing ones, the animals are given the additive after milking. So with the tree-nop, it would have been metabolized from the rumen before, I suppose, the subsequent milking before it had time to do any good, I suppose. They have seen some performance benefits in some other studies, so that the free energy that's not been used to produce methane is redirected towards like some milk production or body weight gain. But we haven't seen anything significant in our studies to date.
And intake, likewise, there was no impact on intake.
No, sorry, in terms of the additives.
Yeah.
No, so with the calcium peroxide additive, there was a slight reduction in intake, but with the other additives, we haven't seen any impact on intake. And because intake is such a big driver of methane output, that's very important to us that we'd measure intake, as Laurence said, using the N-alkane technique once or twice during each trial, just to ensure that, I suppose, the reduction in methane is coming from as a direct effect of the additive, as opposed to the additive reducing intake in the cow and that being the reason why their methane is lower.
Okay. I suppose, Laurence, this is a question for you. Is there funding available for studying innovative solutions from the industry?
To be fair, and we probably should have said this on one or two of the slides, as part of this work, much of this work has been funded with SFI, with industry support, whether that's through Farm Zero C project or through the Vista Mill project. And, within those projects, there has been industry linkages to the project. So certainly the industry are involved in this process and have been quite quick to step up in this. Obviously, we'll always, as a research group, we'll always say that we need more funding. But to be fair, the industry has stepped up in this process.
Okay. Question here, Niall. Sorry, Mark, just one more. Is there withdrawal periods for animals potentially feed additives? Finishing animals. I presume that there's not with milk. There probably isn't with finishing animals either.
Just to go back to Bovaer. Bovaer is not approved for use in beef animals. So just to be clear, so we'll have to wait EFSA guidelines on that. From the dairy side, no, there's no withdrawal. Obviously, it's part of the process. One interesting fact, though, and we found that from all our studies, we stopped feeding the product, and the following day the methane is back up to where it was. So it just shows you how quickly the rumen just goes back to where it was. So it's almost immediate.
And just on that, you talked, Hazel, about the breeding, the grazing management, and the feeding. Then, as the three areas of focus. Can you comment on breeding as a permanent solution versus the need to continuously feed the additive, and just building on that sort of temporary nature of or temporary effect of these additives?
Yeah. That's a very good question, Mark. So I suppose there's no silver bullet here. We need a combination of grazing management, breeding, and feed additives. And as Laurence just touched on there, like when you take out the additives out of the diet, their methane reverts back to normal. And when if you have them in lovely lush spring grass and you put them into high covers, their methane's going to go up. So I suppose breeding provides the only, permanent cumulative solution to reducing methane. The challenge is getting enough data to actually include methane in the likes of the EBI. Like if you think of all the data that we get each year in terms of the milk data and fertility data on ICBF, like hundreds of thousands of records, but we can only measure 30 to 40 animals with one green feed machine. So like data availability is a huge challenge. So we need to scale up methane measurements, and maybe we'll be able to come up with some sort of a proxy for methane. So like looking at the fatty acids in the milk or something like that, and that might give us an idea of ranking cows based on their methane, and we could breed then from those cows. But I suppose breeding provides a permanent solution. It's just how do we get there quickly? So in the meantime, we just need a combination of all three measures.
And Hazel, just to maybe add a little bit to that, like I suppose one of the most really interesting results that we in the paper we published this year showed us that, and you went through it, which means that our EBI actually is probably delivering reduced methane than we thought. Now, our models aren't picking this up yet, and this is no criticism of the inventory or anything like that, because we've never told the models that genetics might be having an effect on methane. So that's the first thing that's really exciting. Breeding could be giving us a benefit, we think is giving us a benefit that we didn't really know about it. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, yeah, we want to directly select for methane, and that's something that Hazel talked about, but we do now have the carbon subindex included in all our indexes. And that's a really important part, because what that does is it takes account of greenhouse gas emissions in our breeding policy. So, that is going to be important as we go forward. Breeding is something that is going to be really important this race. It is going to be take a little bit of time to deliver, but it's going to be really strong when it does start to deliver.
I know you spoke about the focus is largely on the dairy systems. Question here in relation to sheep. Are there any trials having taken place in relation to sheep, or any issues anticipated there?
Yeah, and Mark, there's been lots of work done on beef and sheep, and maybe that's a story for another day. But a lot of the products that we're talking about here are also being worked on with sheep and beef. And again, the story with those are very similar. I suppose the slightly bigger challenge in those systems is getting the material in. So at least in a dairy cow, you have them in a milking parlour mostly twice a day. With beef and sheep, that's a little bit trickier. So the bolus to slow release, the mechanism of getting it into the animal will be more important in those environments.
A question there in relation to monitoring the microbes in the rumen and gut, and could this be a route to reduce methane?
Hazel, do you want to take that?
Yeah. So I suppose, we do take rumen samples as a standard as part of our trials, just to look at the different volatile fatty acids and microbes in the rumen, and to see, I suppose, the effect that the additives would have on those microbes. And we do that as well with the grazing trials to see if the microbial or the VFA population differ based on the grazing treatment they're on, or even based on their genetics. So if there's high methane emitting cows and low methane emitting cows, taking the rumen samples is pretty intensive on the cows. So it's a challenge to do that, and I suppose to scale that up would probably be an issue. But by looking at their microbial population, we can identify cows that are low methane emitting cows and high methane emitting cows. So it's a good thought process in theory, but I suppose executing it is probably a challenge.
I think it's a very pertinent question here. I suppose we're waiting for these feed additives, and a few questions around it. One is to know when realistically can we expect the feed additives to be available on the market, and then secondly, we can't wait for feed additives to be on the market to take action. I suppose there's a lot of other things the farmers can be doing. What are the couple of key things that farmers should be doing until we have these feed additives? When are they likely to come and be realistically available on the market? And then secondly, what are the things that farmers should be focusing on right now?
And to be honest, I suppose the quick answer to that is Bovaer is just about there on the market now. Probably supply would be an issue. So I think very quickly we can start using Bovaer in a dry cow diet, giving us that 22% when it's in the TMR, and start having an effect. Feeding it at grazing is obviously does not make sense with the reductions we're talking about. So they're very, very close. The likes of Bovaer is very close, Siobhan. The next thing, what can farmers do now? And I suppose the key thing here is on a dairy farm, I suppose if we stand back and look at it, there's two things you could do. One, what we're seeing across the season is that there's huge variation, as Hazel pointed out, in enteric methane emissions. So that grazing season length is key, right? And obviously this spring and last autumn are going to be challenges in those years, and we're going to have those challenges. There's the benefits of a grass-based system or the problems associated with grass-based systems, but getting more grass into the cows, getting other, whether it's grass silage, which has a much higher emission factor, out of the diet is one of the most important things. That's one. Two, the grass quality. So grazing, and again, this spring has been a challenge getting good quality grass into cows, but getting to those covers of 12 to 1400, 14 to 1500 will be key in terms of enteric methane. So that's the first one. On the beef side, the key one in beef side is the age of finishing. So we've seen massive reductions in the age of finishing in the last 10 to 12 years. In 2023, we had a slip. And I suppose we just need to get back on the horse again now and get reducing that age of slaughter again. It's the key one for the beef side to reduce enteric methane.
Yeah, we have been focusing our discussion today on additives, feed additives, but I know there's some research happening across the world in relation to vaccines to reduce enteric fermentation. How confident are we, or what stage is that research at, just out of interest?
Yeah, and to be fair to the New Zealanders, have been leading the way on this with probably 20 years, Mark. My understanding is that, there is significant work going on in that space. There's a significant investment going on in that space. And how far or how close we are, it's hard to know to answer that question. But clearly something like that would, be a massive, a 20% reduction in enteric methane is huge in terms of the overall numbers. So certainly, you look at the potential investment that's gone in there, you look at the potential from genetics and the investment that's gone in there, you look at grassland, you look at where we're going from our own emission factors. There's a lot of things to be positive about on this journey.
I'm not sure if we asked you the question. There was a question came in about the use of prebiotics and probiotics on the microbiome. We hear a lot of promotion of these for human health, but has there been much work done in terms of methane reduction?
There is some. There's one or two studies have been done here. There's significant work going on in New Zealand, and again, it's like a lot of this work. The answers can be mixed. Some products work brilliantly, and then for the next study they mightn't work at all. So getting a consistent reduction across a number of studies can be a challenge for some of these products, and that's why I think Hazel drew the attention to Asparagopsis and Bovaer as being the two products that have shown consistent reductions across a whole range of different studies, and that's what we need. We need products that are showing consistent reductions across ranges of different studies. And it's fair to mention a product, a nitrate, is another product that has, across a lot of studies, has shown up 10, 11, 12% reduction in enteric methane.
Okay, we're coming near the end. Siobhan, do you have any last
questions? There's been a couple of questions about methane from manure management. So, all right, we've talked primarily about enteric methane emissions, but I suppose the question to either Laurence or Hazel is, what solutions do we have there at the moment to reduce emissions from methane? Or methane emissions from slurry?
Yeah, and to be honest, Siobhan, it's an area, if you can get excited about an area, this is one that you could get excited about, because there's some really nice studies now, Irish studies showing, again, from the group in Galway, Glassport Bio, that they have a product that has shown, and a paper is published showing a 78% reduction in manure methane, which is quite significant, and a dairy cow produces roughly 12.5 kilos of manure methane per year. So a 78% reduction in that is huge. So if you think about treating a tank of slurry versus treating an individual animal, it's a lot easier to treat a tank of slurry. So I'd be very positive about what can happen in that space. But again, it'll come down to the economics and, where's that funding going to come from to invest in these at farm level?
Okay, we're just up on time, I'm afraid. Thank you so much, Hazel and Laurence, for joining us this morning. And Siobhan, thank you for helping with the questions. And just thanks to Mary in the background for helping us with the technical side of things. Next week, we're going to be joined by Niamh Barry and John Greeny, who are both climate smart advisors. And they're going to be talking to us about how EU projects are supporting climate actions across Europe. And we'll be focused on what's happening on the ground to support farmers in terms of that transition to low carbon footprint farming systems. We will talk to you in a week's time. Okay, thank you. You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.